The sound began as a tremor inside steel, a low, tightening groan. Then the hydraulic ram engaged. Metal answered. Not with a snap, not yet. With a slow, resisting strain that deepened into a frequency only engineers truly hear. A harmonic whisper riding beneath the surface noise of compression. The kind of sound that tells you a structure is approaching its elastic limit, but hasn't surrendered to plastic deformation. I stood behind the reinforced glass panel of my studio and watched the readouts climb. Tensile load, 612 megapascals. Microfracture probability, 0.003%. Acoustic emissions spike at 47.2 Hz. The sample plate, marine-grade steel, certified and documented, arched almost imperceptibly beneath calibrated force. Sensors mapped stress distribution in real time across its surface. Blue zones shifted to amber along the grain boundary where carbon distribution thinned microscopically. This was what truth sounded like. Stress does not lie. The hydraulic press released with a controlled hiss. The metal plate returned to equilibrium. No fracture, no weakness, just confirmation. I removed my headphones and let the resonance linger in the quiet of the room. My studio was deliberately bare. Polished concrete floor. Drafting table centered beneath overhead track lighting. One wall covered in pinned stress maps and hydrodynamic simulations. A single workbench lined with precision calipers, ultrasonic thickness gauges, and a model of the hull I designed. 48 centimeters long, scaled to 1/200th of its intended magnitude. No art, no distraction. Steel does not tolerate sentiment. At 0912 a.m., my phone vibrated against the drafting table. Not a call. An encrypted document. The subject line was corporate neutral. Project reassignment and intellectual property clarification. I already knew what it meant. Captain Sterling preferred polished language when performing an execution. I opened the attachment. The document began with gratitude. It always does. Due to strategic restructuring within the Sterling Maritime initiative, I skimmed to the operative clause. All proprietary design elements, including but not limited to the hull architecture and stress distribution models previously attributed to Sloan Mercer, will be reassigned under the executive oversight of Captain Alastair Sterling. Effective immediately, Sloan Mercer is removed from patent filings and project association. Removed, reassigned, deleted. The word terminated appeared once, buried in paragraph 4, referring to my consultancy agreement. There was no mention of the steel substitution, no mention of cost reductions. No mention of the private procurement deal Sterling had negotiated 6 months ago with a secondary supplier in exchange for expedited material acquisition. I lowered myself into the drafting chair and read the document a second time. Precision matters. They were not claiming ownership through theft. They were claiming authority through hierarchy. The ship, the Aegis Meridian, was scheduled for launch in 11 days. A multi-billion-dollar cargo fleet prototype. Press coverage already positioned it as the most advanced hull design in commercial maritime history. My design, my curvature modeling, my stress gradient mapping across bow flare zones and longitudinal bulkhead reinforcements, my resonance dampening calculations. Sterling's name would appear alone on the patent. He had always called me the math girl, a compliment delivered as dismissal. You make the numbers behave, he used to say with a half-smile, as though mathematics were a pet I kept obedient. He believed design was aesthetic dominance. He believed mentorship entitled him to authorship. He believed I was replaceable. I stood and walked toward the hull model. Ran my fingers lightly along the curve of the bow. The Aegis Meridian wasn't just shaped for speed. It was tuned. Every rib, every longitudinal stiffener, every weld interval calculated against torsional loads and wave impact harmonics across open water conditions. Sterling thought he had my blueprints. He did. What he did not have was the calibration matrix, because I did not merely calculate how the hull would survive stress. I calculated the exact frequency at which it would not. The resonance fracture point, not sabotage, physics. I returned to the drafting table and opened a new file. Outside the studio window, wind pressed against the glass in steady rhythm. 11 days until launch. The ceremony would take place at sea, live broadcast, investors, maritime regulators, global press. Sterling would stand on the deck of my design and claim dominion over steel and ocean alike. I looked at the legal notice once more, deleted from the project, erased from the patent. The hydraulic press behind me powered down with a soft mechanical click. Steel remembers stress, so does its architect. And in 11 days, under open water and calibrated speed, the Aegis Meridian would sing at exactly the frequency I designed. Not to sink, but to reveal. Sterling believed he stole a hull. He never understood he inherited a resonance. 3 years earlier, the Aegis Meridian existed only as curvature on my screen. Sterling called it a dream. I called it a problem. He found me after a lecture at the Naval Engineering Institute. I had just presented a paper on vibrational stress propagation across ultra-long hull frames under irregular wave sequences. Specifically, how minor frequency alignment could amplify torsional oscillation across longitudinal bulkheads. He waited until the room emptied before approaching. "You don't design ships," he said, studying the equations still glowing behind me. "You interrogate them." It sounded like admiration. It was recruitment. Sterling Maritime was expanding into next-generation cargo fleets, longer hulls, thinner profiles, reduced drag coefficients, higher speed across volatile open ocean corridors. Investors were hungry for efficiency metrics, fuel optimization, reduced transit time between Asia and Europe. He offered me autonomy. "You design the hull," he said. No interference. The Aegis Meridian would stretch 398 meters from bow to stern. A vessel built to dominate long-haul freight lanes through the North Atlantic and the South China Sea. Its structural stress tolerance would need to account for rogue wave interactions, asymmetric loading patterns, and harmonic reinforcement across open ocean swells. I accepted. For the first 6 months, Sterling was everything a mentor should be. He secured funding, cleared bureaucratic obstacles, shielded my lab from interference by the board. When procurement delays threatened alloy testing, he made calls. "You're building the future of maritime transport," he would say. "Don't think small." I didn't. The hull design relied on a high-tensile chromium-nickel alloy, marine-grade HY-130 equivalent, enhanced for fatigue resistance. I selected it for one reason: harmonic stability. Long hulls behave like tuning forks. At certain speeds, wave intervals align with structural natural frequencies. If material composition cannot dissipate vibrational energy efficiently, stress accumulates across rib joints and longitudinal stiffeners. Over time, microfractures propagate invisibly along weld seams. I built safeguards into the meridian, double-layered longitudinal reinforcements across the midship region. Variable rib spacing to disrupt harmonic amplification. Alloy selection calibrated to absorb vibrational energy before it could escalate toward resonance thresholds. The stress simulations were beautiful. At 22 knots, the hull remained within safe elastic limits under 6-meter wave sets. At 24 knots, vibrational amplitude increased but remained controlled. At 26 knots under specific wave intervals, 7-second swell frequency, the hull approached a measurable amplification zone, not catastrophic, predictable, designable. I documented everything. Sterling praised the progress publicly. "Our structural analysis division is rewriting maritime engineering," he told investors during a private presentation. "My slides, my models, my work." The first fracture appeared not in steel, but in procurement. 9 months before launch, alloy delivery timelines shifted. "Supply chain disruptions," Sterling said casually, leaning back in his office chair. His walls were lined with framed photographs of ships he claimed to have commanded into history. "We can't delay," he continued. "Investors are watching, we'll substitute temporarily." "With what?" I asked. "High-carbon marine steel. It meets industry minimums. Minimums are not design philosophy. I requested material specification sheets. He waved a hand dismissively. You worry too much. Steel is steel. It is. The substituted alloy contained lower nickel content and higher carbon concentration. Its fatigue resistance curve flattened earlier under cyclic loading. Its vibrational damping capacity was inferior by measurable margins. At 22 knots, it behaved acceptably. At 24, minor oscillation increases appeared in simulation. At 26 knots, under 8.7-second swells, harmonic amplification intensified significantly. Not immediate rupture. Progressive stress concentration. I brought the revised models to Sterling's office. This alloy shifts the resonance envelope, I said, projecting simulation overlays across his wall. He studied the graphics without studying the data. We don't operate at 26 knots in those conditions, he replied smoothly. Launch events are unpredictable, I countered. Open water doesn't honor investor timelines, he smiled. Investors don't care about theoretical resonance. The next month, I discovered a second substitution. Weld seam reinforcement downgraded to thinner rib plates to reduce weight. Weight reduction reduces fuel cost. It also reduces structural margin. I confronted him again. You're narrowing safety tolerances for profit, I said quietly. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking the shipyard. Sloan, he began, voice calm, we are building a fleet, not a laboratory exhibit. You're gambling with harmonic amplification. He turned back toward me. You're a brilliant analyst, he said. But you don't understand scale. Shipping isn't about perfection, it's about margins. Margins. There it was. The alloy substitution saved millions across fleet production. Procurement contracts quietly shifted to a secondary supplier, one owned through layered shell companies I later traced back to Sterling himself. He wasn't merely cutting costs. He was rerouting savings. 2 months before the patent filing, my access to the central documentation repository narrowed. Drafts of the hull design began appearing under joint authorship. Then solely under his name. I confronted him one final time in the dry dock, beneath the skeletal ribs of the Meridian's half-completed frame. You replaced the alloy, I said. You altered the weld schedule, and now you're removing my name. He looked up at the rising steel structure with theatrical admiration. You did excellent work, he replied. But innovation needs a captain. I calculated the stress envelope, and I secured the funding. He turned toward me then, eyes sharpened. You're a math girl, Sloan, exceptional with numbers. But ships are built by vision. Vision does not override physics. I left the dock that afternoon with the resonance simulations saved offline. Because while Sterling believed alloy substitution was a financial maneuver, I knew something he did not. The cheaper carbon steel did not eliminate resonance. It sharpened it. The fracture point remained invisible at standard operating speeds. But at precisely 26 knots, under 8.7-second swell intervals, the hull would begin to sing. Not immediately tear. Not dramatically rupture, but vibrate with amplified structural truth. Sterling thought he was pocketing millions. He never asked what happened when cost-cutting intersected with harmonic inevitability. He stole my design. He never understood my calculations. And steel, unlike men, obeys the laws written into it. Exactly. The day they escorted me out, the hull was already afloat. The Aegis Meridian rested in dry dock, skeletal ribs now plated and sealed, its bow angled toward open water like an animal waiting for release. Workers moved along scaffolding lines in orange harnesses. Welding arcs flared in short, blinding bursts against gray steel. I had spent 34 consecutive hours recalculating stress tolerances using the downgraded carbon steel parameters. The numbers were clean, the margins were thinner, but they were precise. At 10:03 a.m., my access credentials failed. The design terminal blinked once. Then, user authentication revoked. I didn't react immediately. Systems malfunction, permissions refresh, server lag. I tried again, the same message. The door behind me opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. Two security officers entered, not aggressive, not apologetic, corporate neutral. Ms. Mercer, the taller one said, "We've been instructed to escort you from the premises." "I'm running final stress calibration," I replied without turning. "You no longer have clearance." Sterling had always preferred choreography. I shut down the terminal manually. I removed my external drive, slid it into my jacket pocket. The escort wasn't dramatic. No raised voices. No spectacle. Engineers in adjacent bays avoided eye contact. The sound of metal cutting continued uninterrupted. Progress does not pause for personnel adjustments. As we walked past the hull, I allowed myself one final glance at the midship region. The longitudinal stiffeners along frame 142 to 189 carried the most significant resonance load at peak amplification. That was where harmonic vibration would concentrate under sustained speed. That was also where I left something behind. They confiscated my badge at the exit gate, my office key, my digital token. They did not confiscate knowledge. Exile, I learned quickly, is quieter than people imagine. My apartment overlooked a commercial marina 3 miles north of the shipyard. The walls were white. The desk faced a single window. I replaced drafting tables with 2 monitors, a hardened laptop, and a small server rack mounted discreetly beneath the desk. Minimal, functional, invisible, I did not rage. Rage consumes bandwidth. Instead, I opened the fleet's public data portal. All modern cargo vessels transmit standardized telemetry: speed, heading, engine load, ballast distribution. Automatic identification system feeds are accessible globally. Sterling believed removing me from internal access meant I could no longer observe the meridian. He underestimated redundancy. During final hull assembly, I embedded a passive structural vibration sensor within the rib cavity of frame 173. A microelectromechanical accelerometer calibrated to measure harmonic oscillation across longitudinal stress bands. It was smaller than a coin. Self-powered through kinetic energy conversion, harvesting vibrational microcurrents, and transmitting in compressed bursts through encrypted signal piggybacking on standard hull integrity diagnostics. It did not interfere, it did not alter, it listened. I named it Echo. The first time Echo transmitted post-launch, I was seated cross-legged on my apartment floor, laptop balanced against the coffee table. Timestamp: 02:14 a.m. Signal strength, weak but stable. Hull vibration baseline at 18 knots, nominal, amplitude within projected limits. I leaned back and allowed myself a slow breath. Weeks passed. Sterling paraded the meridian across industry conferences. Trade publications celebrated the innovative structural resilience of his fleet. Investors applauded fuel efficiency metrics and aggressive expansion projections. I monitored quietly. At 22 knots in moderate seas, vibration remained controlled. At 24, oscillation amplitude rose slightly, matching my recalibrated models for downgraded steel. The data did not lie. Sterling began pushing the meridian harder. Speed trials extended beyond conservative thresholds. Press releases boasted record transit times across volatile waters. On a gray afternoon in late October, Echo transmitted under heavier load. Speed 25.4 knots. Wave interval 8.2 seconds. Oscillation amplitude rising, not dangerous, approaching. The harmonic curve steepened precisely as my model predicted. I opened the stress envelope simulations side by side with live data. The lines began to converge. Exile gave me something Sterling never possessed: silence. From silence, patterns emerge clearly. He believed he erased me from the project. He deleted my name from documentation, removed my face from photographs, but he sailed my equations into open water. And every time the meridian cut across a wave at increasing speed, Echo whispered back to me through the dark. Steel remembers its architect, so does its resonance, and I was still listening. The alert came at 03:47 a.m. Not dramatic, not cinematic, a shift in waveform density. Echo transmitted a compressed packet flagged outside normal deviation parameters. I was awake already. Insomnia is common when you monitor inevitability. The Meridian had altered course 12 hours earlier, rerouting north of its standard Atlantic freight lane. I pulled up Maritime weather overlays. A low-pressure system was forming west of the Azores. Not catastrophic, not headline-making, but unstable. Barometric drop, 14 millibars in 6 hours. Swell patterns stacking irregularly across two intersecting wind corridors. Wave interval variability between 7.9 and 8.9 seconds. I leaned forward. The Meridian's projected path would intersect the densest oscillation zone in 14 hours. I opened the resonance envelope model I built 3 years ago, overlaying it with the downgraded carbon steel parameters Stirling had insisted on. Resonance is not about height. It is about rhythm. The hull's natural vibrational frequency, under longitudinal stress, sat at 0.115 Hz under optimal alloy conditions. With substituted steel, that frequency shifted subtly upward due to altered elasticity modulus and damping inefficiency. Under 26 knots, under consistent 8.7-second swell intervals. The vibrational amplification would synchronize, not instant failure, progressive harmonic escalation across midship ribs, frame 142 to 189. I pulled up live AIS telemetry. Speed, 24.8 knots. Engine output rising. Cargo manifest indicated partial load, less ballast weight to damp oscillation. Why push speed into unstable water? Then I saw the reason. Stirling had scheduled a live maritime demonstration. Investors aboard. A mid-voyage showcase to highlight the fleet's unmatched resilience under dynamic ocean conditions. He was chasing spectacle again. Echo transmitted another packet. Hull vibration amplitude, increasing. 0.087 G, 0.093 G, trending upward beyond projected curves for 24 knots. I opened the wave forecast grid in high resolution. The low-pressure system had matured faster than predicted. Wind vectors converged from two opposing fronts, creating interference patterns in open water. Wave sets were beginning to synchronize. 8.6 seconds. 8.8 seconds, then stabilizing at 8.7. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. The model was no longer theoretical. It was aligning. I recalibrated the resonance calculation using live telemetry inputs, hull length, rib spacing. Elastic modulus of substituted steel. Current ballast distribution. The curve rose cleanly across my screen. At 25.6 knots under 8.7-second swells, amplification crossed one relative stress factor. At 25.9 knots, oscillation approached exponential gain. At 26 knots, sustained for 90 seconds, the line sharpened. Longitudinal weld seams across frame 173 would begin microfracture propagation. Not explosion, not cinematic rupture. Structural fatigue under accelerated harmonic load. If sustained beyond 140 seconds, torsional stress could exceed safety margins by 17%. 17% is the difference between resilience and revelation. I leaned back slowly. The Meridian's speed ticked upward. 25.1, 25.3. Echo transmitted again. 0.101 G. The ocean does not care about investor optics. Wind velocity increased to 38 knots. Wave height climbed to 5.8 meters, but it wasn't the height that mattered. It was the rhythm. Perfect storm zones are rarely perfect. They are statistically improbable alignments of pressure gradients and wave interference. Tonight, improbability was collapsing into precision. I ran the model one final time, feeding in real-time oscillation data. The output stabilized. Time to resonance threshold at projected speed increase, 11 minutes 42 seconds after crossing 25.8 knots. Stirling would push to 26. He always did, because round numbers look powerful in press releases. I stood and walked toward the hull model resting on my shelf. 3 years of calculations distilled into curvature and steel memory. I did not design failure. I designed tolerance. Sterling narrowed the margins. The ocean supplied the rest. Echo pulsed again. Speed 25.7 knots. Wave interval 8.7 seconds. Oscillation amplitude climbing cleanly along the predicted curve. I opened a new file. Title: Resonance Event Projection. Meridian. If the hull crossed 26 knots sustained for 90 seconds, the ship would begin to sing at the exact frequency I mapped years ago. Not to sink, but to expose. Steel does not scream, it vibrates. And tonight, vibration was approaching inevitability. The Atlantic was steel gray under a bruised sky. Wind carved sharp lines across the water, flattening wave crests into white scars. The Aegis Meridian cut through it with theatrical confidence, floodlights illuminating her hull like a monument in motion. On the upper observation deck, beneath a transparent canopy engineered to withstand hurricane-force gusts, the launch celebration was in full display. Crystal glassware trembled subtly on polished tables. Waitstaff in dark uniforms navigated carefully across anti-slip decking. World leaders, maritime regulators, and institutional investors stood in clusters beneath banners that read, Sterling Maritime, redefining ocean resilience. Captain Alastair Sterling stood at the center. Black overcoat tailored to precision. Salt threaded into his hair like deliberate aging. He held a microphone with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the future. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice amplified across deck speakers and live-streamed to global networks. You are standing on the most structurally advanced cargo vessel ever engineered. Wind surged. The Meridian adjusted her bow into oncoming swell. Below deck, the engines increased throttle. I watched from my studio, 600 miles away, where 3 monitors displayed synchronized feeds. AIS telemetry, Echo's vibration data, and the Meridian's public hull integrity camera system. I did not need to breach their firewall. Sterling's vanity provided access. The live stream infrastructure was integrated with the ship's bridge communications for investor transparency. Signal encryption was robust for commercial traffic, not for someone who built the system's original architecture. 3 years earlier, I wrote the redundancy protocol that allowed remote diagnostics during open water trials. It was never removed, because no one thought to remove me from the code. On deck, Sterling gestured toward the horizon. At 26 knots, he declared proudly, the Meridian maintains structural equilibrium under dynamic wave interference. There it was, 26. On my screen, speed climbed, 25.8 knots. Wave interval stabilized at 8.7 seconds. Echo transmitted. 0.113 G oscillation approaching resonance envelope. I opened the bridge communication protocol and injected a silent handshake into the auxiliary diagnostics port. No alarms triggered. The channel accepted my authentication signature. Sterling always believed my credentials were erased. They were archived, not deleted. The bridge camera feed flickered momentarily on my monitor, then stabilized. Officers in crisp uniforms monitored engine load and navigation vectors. No one sensed intrusion. I wasn't altering course. Not yet. On deck, applause followed Sterling's declaration. Tonight, he continued, raising his glass, we prove that innovation conquers the ocean. I activated the auxiliary engine calibration module. The Meridian's propulsion system used a distributed torque management algorithm, one I optimized to prevent uneven strain across port and starboard shafts. I did not override. I adjusted. A minor correction to torque symmetry, 0.3% increase, speed edged upward, 25.9 knots. Echo pulsed sharply, 0.118 G hull vibration aligning with harmonic projection. I opened the hull integrity camera array, high-resolution feeds mounted along midship ribs for maintenance diagnostics. Frame 142, frame 156, frame 173. The steel looked pristine under floodlights. Sterling's voice swelled over deck speakers. This fleet, he said, will reshape global trade. I engaged the final calibration. Speed locked at 26 knots. Sustained. Wind battered the canopy. Glassware chimed faintly across tables. Echo transmitted continuous data now. 0.124G, 0.129G, the resonance curve steepened. On my monitor, the amplification graph crossed one relative stress factor. The hull began to sing, not audibly, but through data. On the bridge, an officer frowned at a minor vibration alert. "Engine load fluctuation," he muttered. Sterling continued speaking. "Resilience is not theoretical. It is built into every plate of steel." Frame 173 camera feed sharpened. A faint line appeared along the weld seam. Not dramatic. Hairline. I routed the hull camera feed into the live broadcast overlay. The shift was seamless, diagnostic transparency framed as innovation showcase. On deck, a large display screen behind Sterling flickered. He glanced back, assuming a visual effect. Instead, the screen showed a magnified live image of frame 173's weld seam. A thin silver fissure traced along the rib joint. The crowd murmured softly. Sterling's smile faltered for half a second. "Minor surface expansion under stress," he improvised smoothly. Echo transmitted. 0.137G oscillation amplitude rising. Frame 156 now showed microfracture branching along carbon-rich grain boundaries, exactly where downgraded alloy fatigue curves predicted weakness. I opened the bridge communication channel. Audio override engaged. My voice entered the deck speakers without distortion. "Captain Sterling." The wind carried my tone across the canopy. Calm, measured, Sterling froze. The crowd turned. "Who is this?" he demanded, scanning the deck. "You're currently sustaining 26 knots under 8.7-second swell intervals," I said evenly. "Resonance amplification is increasing across midship frames." His eyes hardened. "Sloan." Recognition without surprise. "You removed my name," I continued, "but you did not remove the physics." Behind him, the screen magnified the fissures spreading incrementally along frame 173. Investors leaned forward. World leaders exchanged tight glances. "This is impossible," Sterling said into the microphone, though he knew it was. "You substituted chromium-nickel alloy with high-carbon marine steel," I stated. "Reduced weld reinforcement thickness by 14%, altered rib spacing." The hull's natural frequency shifted. The ship vibrated subtly beneath the deck, not violent, persistent. "Reduce speed," one bridge officer whispered off-screen. Sterling lifted a hand sharply, silencing him. "You're interfering with a live demonstration," Sterling said, forcing composure. "Cease transmission." "I am demonstrating structural truth," I replied. Echo's graph peaked at 0.149G frame, 142 camera, now revealed secondary microfractures radiating outward like frost veins across steel. Gasps spread across the canopy. "It will not sink," I clarified calmly, "but sustained resonance beyond 140 seconds will propagate fatigue beyond safe tolerance." "Slow the engines," a regulator shouted. Sterling's jaw tightened. He understood the optics now. If he reduced speed, he admitted vulnerability. If he maintained it, he risked structural escalation. The choice was not about steel, it was about pride. I spoke once more. "Resilience is not declared, Captain, it is calculated." Silence. Wind. Steel vibration beneath the deck like a low pulse. "Then throttle down to 22 knots, Sterling ordered sharply. The engines obeyed. Speed dropped. Echo's graph fell gradually. 0.132G, 0.118G. G. The microfractures remained visible on screen. Irrefutable. The hull had not catastrophically failed. It had revealed. Sterling lowered the microphone. The ocean continued moving as it always had. Under floodlights, beneath global broadcast, the Aegis Meridian stood exposed, not as innovation but as compromise. I disconnected from the bridge, closed the auxiliary channel. Echo's final transmission that night stabilized at baseline oscillation. Steel had spoken, and it spoke in numbers. The arrest did not happen on deck. It happened in a conference room. 3 days after the resonance event, the Meridian sat in a secured harbor berth under inspection lights that never turned off. Surveyors in reflective jackets moved across her hull with ultrasonic scanners, documenting microfracture propagation across frames 142 through 189. Each scan produced a clean, unforgiving image, stress lines branching precisely where inferior carbon steel lost its fatigue margin. The footage from the launch replayed across financial networks in slow motion. The moment the weld seam first shimmered, the instant Sterling's smile hesitated. The exact second the hull cameras exposed the fissures to the world, regulatory authorities initiated an emergency structural audit across the entire fleet. Procurement contracts were subpoenaed within 48 hours. The alloy certificates did not match the original engineering specifications filed under my name 3 years earlier. Material composition reports showed nickel content reduced below premium grade tolerance. Carbon percentages elevated beyond the fatigue resistance threshold required for long-haul harmonic stability. It was not a design flaw, it was a substitution. Fraud at maritime scale is rarely dramatic. It is documented, it is traced, it is itemized across invoices and shell accounts and procurement ledgers. Sterling's secondary supplier, an offshore entity layered behind 2 holding corporations, was linked directly to a private investment account registered under his control. Cost savings had not gone to the company. They had gone to him. The arrest warrant cited maritime endangerment, securities fraud, and material misrepresentation to regulatory authorities. When officers entered the Sterling Maritime Executive Boardroom, there was no resistance. He was seated at the head of the table, suit immaculate, hands folded. Captain Alastair Sterling, the lead investigator, said evenly, "You are being detained pending investigation into fraudulent material substitution and risk concealment." Sterling did not look surprised. He looked inconvenienced. "You're making a spectacle," he replied calmly. The investigator slid a tablet across the table. Hull fracture images, procurement discrepancies. My original alloy specifications side by side with the substituted steel composition. Spectacle had already occurred. Steel had testified. He stood without argument. For a man who believed innovation was performance, the silence of handcuffs was efficient. 2 weeks later, the board convened again, this time without Sterling's name engraved on the glass wall. The Meridian remained operational at reduced speeds under reinforced inspection protocol. Emergency, retrofitting plans were drafted for the remaining vessels in production. I entered the boardroom without escort, no dramatic entrance, no applause. The chairman adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Ms. Mercer," he began, "your predictive modeling prevented catastrophic escalation." "It prevented sustained resonance," I corrected evenly. "The ocean prevented the rest." Several board members shifted uncomfortably. They had applauded Sterling's cost reductions. They had approved aggressive speed trials. Now they studied the microfracture maps with reverence. "We require leadership within engineering," the chairman continued. "Independent oversight. Full material transparency." "You require structural integrity," I replied. A pause. "Will you accept the role of Director of Engineering?" "Titles do not interest me. Authority over tolerances does." "Yes," I said simply. The transition was not celebratory. It was procedural. I returned to the shipyard 3 months later. The Meridian was docked in dry repair, midship plating partially removed. Reinforcement ribs replaced with proper chromium-nickel alloy. Weld seams restructured according to my original stress distribution schedule. The sound of grinding steel echoed through the bay. Familiar, clean. No banners hung from scaffolding. No press conferences occurred beneath floodlights. Only calibrated torque wrenches and controlled arc welders restoring structural margin where greed had narrowed it. My office was smaller than Sterling's had been. No panoramic window. Just a drafting table and a terminal linked directly to fleet telemetry. Echo was no longer necessary. I had authorized internal vibration monitoring upgrades across every vessel in production. Redundancy layered into every structural band. The resonance fracture point remained documented in secured files, not as a weapon, but as a safeguard. Speed trials resumed months later under controlled conditions. At 26 knots, with proper alloy and reinforced rib spacing, the hull absorbed harmonic load without amplification. Steel behaved as designed. One evening, after the yard emptied and welding arcs dimmed into darkness, I stood alone beside the Meridian's hull. My hand rested against cool metal. No vibration. No hidden compromise, just structure meeting ocean honestly. Sterling's trial continued quietly in maritime courtrooms far from here. Financial restitution claims mounted. His personal accounts frozen. His name removed from industry boards and registries. Erasure, when deserved, is administrative. I returned to my apartment overlooking the marina. The monitors hummed softly. Telemetry streamed in disciplined lines of data. No alarms, no amplification. Silence engineered correctly. I powered down the terminal. Steel remembers stress. But when designed with integrity, it does not sing under pressure. It endures. And I returned, as I always do, to the quiet that mathematics provides. Not vengeance, completion.